on cake. Thanks for coming. My name is Rory Isbell. I'm a third-year student here at the U of O School of Law and also the Department of Planning, Public Policy, and Management. And this year I am a Sustainable Cities Initiative Fellow for the ENR Center's Sustainable Land Use Project. So I'm one of the three students who's organized tonight's event, along with Alexis Biddle and Gordon Levitt. So along with the ENR Center, tonight's panel is hosted by the University of Oregon Sustainable Cities Initiative, as well as Land, Air, Water, our environmental law student society here at the law school. And then along with my fellow Sustainable Land Use Project fellows, we're the ones that put tonight's panel together. So just a quick thanks to you guys for helping out with that. So this panel is called Greening Gray Infrastructure. I'm going to quickly explain sort of what we mean by that, and then of course I'll let our panelists go into more detail. Nearly all the infrastructure that we currently have, you could consider gray. So things like our roads, our water infrastructure, sewer systems, utility infrastructure, all of that we can call gray because it really relies on engineering and industrial materials in the way that we design and build those things. In contrast, what we're calling green infrastructure tonight refers more to the ability of our natural environment to accomplish some of those same goals that we currently rely on that gray infrastructure to do. So that's what we mean by the title of the panel. And as I said, we'll explore that in much more detail as we go on. So now I'll introduce our speakers. First, we have Rebecca Lewis, who is an assistant professor of planning, public policy, and management here at the University of Oregon, and a faculty affiliate at the National Center for Smart Growth, Research and Education at the University of Maryland. She currently serves as the research director for the Sustainable Cities Initiative here at the U of O. She holds a Master of Public Policy degree from the University of Maryland and a PhD in Urban and Regional Planning and Design from the University of Maryland. Dr. Lewis was a 2010 Lincoln Institute of Land Policy C. Lowell Harris Dissertation Fellow, and she received the 2012 Barclay Gibbs Jones Award for the Best Dissertation in Planning from the American Collegiate Schools of Planning for her dissertation evaluating the efficacy of smart growth in Maryland. Her research has been published in peer-reviewed journals, including the Journal of the American Planning Association, State and Local Government Review, and the American Journal of Public Health. Her research broadly focuses on state land use policy, the integration of climate, transportation, and land use planning, state and local finance, and measuring urban form. Currently, she is working on 3 projects funded by the National Institute for Transportation and Communities, and recently she received funding to study best practices for preventing land conversion in the Chesapeake Bay watershed from the Chesapeake Bay program. At the University of Oregon, she teaches courses in growth management, sustainable cities, public budget administration, and research methods. I think I've taken 3 of those 4 courses. So she does an excellent job in all of them. Moving on, we have Jonathan Rosenblum, who is a professor of law and director of environmental and sustainability programming at Drake University Law School, teaching in the areas of environmental law, sustainability, and state and local government. We're lucky this semester to have him as a visiting professor here at the University of Oregon. His research focuses on collective action challenges, particularly environmental challenges facing local governments. And he's been published in the Hastings Law Journal, the Brigham Young University Law Review, Harvard Environmental Law Review, and others. Jonathan founded the Drake Fellowship in Sustainability Law for 2 Drake students each year. This fellowship is fully supported by external funds, and it focuses on drafting model local ordinances on issues relevant to sustainability. Jonathan received his bachelor's in architecture from the Rhode Island School of Design, his JD from New York Law School, and LLM from Harvard Law School. Prior to teaching, he worked as an attorney for federal government, for a nonprofit Urban Research Institute, and for Reed Smith LLP, where he co-managed the real estate division. Immediately prior to entering academia, he founded a nonprofit that worked with state and local governments on becoming more sustainable, and clerked for the Honorable Rosemary Barquette on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. He is a commissioner on the Des Moines Plan and Zoning Commission and serves on a number of state and local environmental boards, including as chair of Central Iowa's Regional Economic Development Sustainability Committee, representing 4,700 businesses. He was named Drake Law School 2013 Outstanding Professor of the Year and is currently writing a textbook with Shelley Saxer from Pepperdine called Resilience and Sustainability Theory and Practice. Finally, these are very accomplished people, as you can tell. I'm taking one. Finally, we have Professor Keith HIROKAWA, who joined the faculty at Albany Law School in 2009. He teaches courses involving environmental and natural resources law, land use planning, property law, and jurisprudence. Professor HIROKAWA's scholarship explores convergences in ecology, ethics, economics, and law, with particular attention given to local government law, ecosystem services policy, watershed management, and environmental impact analysis. His books include Greening Local Government, Legal Strategies for Promoting Sustainability, Efficiency, and Fiscal Savings, Environmental Law and Contrasting Ideas of Nature, a Constructivist Approach, and Rethinking Sustainable Development to Meet the Climate Change Challenge. Prior to joining the faculty at Albany Law, Professor HIROKAWA was an associate professor at Texas Wesleyan University School of Law and an adjunct professor here at our own University of Oregon School of Law. Professor HIROKAWA practiced land use and environmental law in Oregon and Washington, and was heavily involved with community groups and nonprofit organizations. Professor HIROKAWA studied philosophy and law at the University of Connecticut, where he earned his JD and MA degrees. He earned his LLM in environmental and natural resources law from Lewis and Clark Law School. So, thank you to our three panelists for being here today. As I mentioned, we have cake in the back, so if you haven't helped yourselves, help yourselves. We also have note cards in the room where we encourage you to write questions that you might have for the panelists throughout the event. And at the end, Gordon and Alexis will facilitate a discussion based on your questions. So I will now pass it off to Rebecca Lewis, who's going to get us started.
Thanks, Roy. So we all decided we're going to sit because it's such a small room and wants to be a little bit more intimate, I think. So I'm starting off today primarily talking about the gray side of things in terms of how we connect infrastructure to planning, primarily in dealing with new infrastructure. So I'm going to start by talking about how public facilities shape growth, then get into how we've reacted to this understanding that public facilities do shape growth, to implement policies that influence public facilities, and then talk about how we impose fees to pay for infrastructure, briefly touch on how Oregon addresses planning for infrastructure. Again, the big takeaway that I'm going to get to now and I'll harp on at the end is a lot of our systems that tie growth to infrastructure really focus on the gray side of things, how we pay for stormwater, how we pay for water and sewer infrastructure, how we pay for roads, for things like impact fees. And you'll hear from both Jonathan and Keith about some local examples of the opposite, of trying to be greener about this approach. So some of these slides will be familiar to many of my students that are in the room that have had some of these courses. I'm starting with understanding that infrastructure and development are related. So there's lots of things that drive where development happens. One of those things is the regulatory framework and the legal framework, things like zoning. But there's also other things that relate to infrastructure and accessibility that make land developable and are very important for figuring out where development will happen. All of this sounds like common sense to us, but historically we have reacted to, infrastructure has reacted to growth instead of guided growth. And so this framework I'm presenting acknowledges the connection between infrastructure and growth. So a scholar in planning, Eric Kelly, has a quote that says, what public facilities do is influence the location of growth. So building infrastructure doesn't mean that development will come. Meaning that infrastructure is necessary but not sufficient for development. What I'm getting at here is that infrastructure is a necessary component to our development patterns. Most of this being built around things like potable water, sewer, transportation, things that we'll talk about greening approaches later on. So there's four main ways that public facilities shape growth. One way is through the cost side of things. That infrastructure is very expensive, and so building near places that already have infrastructure capacity makes development cheaper. There's also the legal side of things in terms of tying comprehensive plans to capital improvement programs and where you're allowed to expand infrastructure. What place, using things like urban service boundaries and urban growth boundaries to control where infrastructure can go. There's also the accessibility factor, that you're not going to have a neighborhood take off if it's far away from all jobs in the middle of nowhere. Being close to jobs and close to retail and those sorts of things matters as well. The last one gets at livability in terms of needing access to water. As you're going to hear later on, we've often engineered our way into water supply. A lot of these greening approaches flip that on its head in terms of thinking about where water supply exists. But these are some of the basic ways in which public facilities impact where growth occurs. So all of this ties in with the framework of how states manage growth and what states have done to think about this infrastructure connection. So this field called growth management, which is where I place myself academically in my research, focuses on how states use their legal authority to influence where growth occurs. There's a thing in land use planning that we refer to as the Quiet Revolution, which was when states started taking authority back from local governments and using state authority to influence where development happens. The first wave of that was more of a control approach of where development happens. This was primarily for environmental reasons and used very regulatory, stringent approaches to saying where development can and cannot grow. The approach that is of more interest to what we're talking about today is the growth management approach, which gets more at the where and the how we pay for it side of where development happens. So it's not just about environmental issues or agriculture, it's also about how we pay for growth. And a shift from the federal government paying for a lot of infrastructure for local governments having to pay for it themselves. And so here we're thinking about the physical costs of growth. We're using things like urban service areas and concurrency, which I'll talk about later on, to affect where growth happens. The last big wave in growth management is this more recent wave, which we refer to as smart growth. This gets at more of the quality of life and substance of growth. This is often referred to as more of an incentive-based approach to deciding where growth happens and how growth happens, as opposed to a regulatory approach. And so one example of this out of the state of Maryland is requiring that all growth-related state funding happens in particular areas. And so that's another example of using state funding to influence the location of growth through infrastructure provision. What is relevant about this middle panel of growth management is that it reflects this growth shapers approach, that public facilities influence where growth happens, that infrastructure is important to the location of development. So what this is saying is that where we make our public infrastructure investments impact where roads go, where we have sewer system capacity, where we have water available, and that influences where development happens. Again, the type of growth that happens is a function of how much infrastructure exists, and we understand that infrastructure shapes growth. The reason, again, this is important is because for several decades, we're reacting with infrastructure provision as opposed to being proactive about deciding where growth goes based on where infrastructure exists. And so many of the policy approaches I'll be mentioning get at this, acknowledging this connection between infrastructure and development. So ways in which we tie growth to facilities, there's some examples of policies that can tie these things better. I'm not going to go into great depth about this. I want to get to some of the more specific examples. But one way that we can tie growth to where facilities exist is by having a timing element for our future land uses to acknowledge that the future land use exists when infrastructure exists. We also have timing controls on permanent development to give timeouts for land that's been permitted but not built on. In terms of infrastructure, we use things called adequate public facility standards, which basically says infrastructure has to exist before development proceeds. Another example of this that I think Jonathan and Keith are going to talk about a little bit as well is that our investments are guided by the comprehensive plan as opposed to being guided by individual development projects. So we have a big picture vision for where we want infrastructure to go, and everything is based on that comprehensive plan. There's a couple other things I'll talk about as well. One of these is using a particular type of fee, impact fees, to tie infrastructure to development as development is permitted. So the new development is paying for infrastructure. Another example that I know Jonathan is going to talk about gets at this more systems approach and getting different agencies within state, local government to talk to each other and work together in terms of how we provide infrastructure. So some specific policies that can help us make this connection better. Basic things like subdivision regulations and land development codes are examples of mechanisms for making these connections. And two examples that I'll talk a little bit more about get at the financing side of things and exactions and impact fees. As well as concurrency, which is this policy approach that says development does not proceed unless infrastructure is in place. I'm not going to talk a ton about exactions and impact fees. I'm going to mention them briefly just as a way to say, but all of these mechanisms that we use focus primarily on the gray infrastructure side of things and don't build in a lot of wiggle room in terms of how we can accommodate a green infrastructure approach to sort of adjust these mechanisms. So development exactions are provisions that happen in the development approval process before the developer gets approval to go forward with development. That usually looks like land for parks and schools, physical improvements on the site itself, improving the roads that might be leading into development projects, and sometimes using fees in lieu of providing these things. Exactions, I'm going to go through this somewhat quickly. Exactions are popular because they make sure that new growth pays for itself, and it makes sure that you're providing infrastructure. With impact fees, instead, we're charging a monetary charge on local governments for new development to recoup the cost of those public facilities. There's a large legal framework that exists around impact fees, and I'm not going to go into great depth about. But the point of this is getting new residents to pay for the cost of providing infrastructure as opposed to existing residents. In the planning realm, these have been called the most rational step in the evolution of providing infrastructure finance because it gets new development to pay for itself. Impact fees are useful in terms of protecting the existing residents, making sure that you've got the funding to provide infrastructure, getting developers to internalize the cost, and allowing development to proceed even if the local government can't pay for it, which means that it can be a response to the no-growth, anti-growth movement. What this often looks like is we charge impact fees for different types of things. Again, things that we think about as gray infrastructure, things like roads, water, wastewater. We come up with formulas to decide how we're charging these things. But again, as I've said, we don't build in a lot of wiggle room for, well, what if you have a rain barrel? What if you have low impact development in terms of stormwater? What if you are using a composting toilet or something like that? We charge these on sort of an average cost basis to all units without building a lot of flexibility in. In Eugene, we have examples of impact fees that are called system development charges in Oregon, charged for things like transportation, wastewater, stormwater, and parks. Another example is more of a policy approach, which ties development approval to the provision of adequate public facilities. This means that infrastructure must be in place when development occurs. So this impacts the location and intensity of development, and this is a proactive approach to understanding this connection between development and infrastructure. Concurrency is useful in terms of tying the timing of public services into the provision of infrastructure, making sure the development doesn't outstrip facilities, economizing on the cost, making sure the development pays for itself, while also allowing development to proceed even if local governments can't pay for it. It's also used as a growth management effort to decide where growth occurs. Finally, in Oregon, I want to talk a little bit about how public facilities work in Oregon and how this ties in with urban growth boundaries and annexation. So in Oregon, we have a statewide land use program, which requires all cities to have urban growth boundaries. Urban growth boundaries designate which land will eventually be available for development. So we want the state statutes say that urban growth boundaries accommodate 20 years of residential and employment growth. We also have 19 statewide goals that must be incorporated in local plans, and one of those focuses specifically on infrastructure. It defines what urban services are, again, and what you think about as primarily gray infrastructure. And there's mechanisms for making sure that these things are included and provided at a high standard. The biggest deal here with urban services in Oregon is in order for urban development to proceed, meaning higher density development distinguished from rural development, the land must be annexed into city limits before that kind of development can happen. And that means that the city has to show that they can provide infrastructure to that land. And so it's not a matter of adding land to the urban growth boundary to then provide services. It's a matter of when it becomes annexed into city limits that we make sure that infrastructure is provided. So the key takeaways from this big picture I'm starting with get at this relationship between infrastructure and development. Infrastructure is necessary for development. Historically, there's been a disconnect between comprehensive planning, capital improvement planning, and infrastructure decisions. But policies like concurrency, impact fees, and exactions let us resolve some of those issues by allowing development to pay for itself. But at the same time, this connection still focuses on the gray infrastructure side of things and doesn't speak to allowing for providing green infrastructure instead. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Jonathan.
Well, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Alexis and Rory and Gordon and Emily and the other. And special thanks to Keith for traveling across country. It's great to see you. So I'd like to continue the conversation that Rebecca was starting us off with and really explore land use laws as both opportunities and constraints. Opportunities which can really support resilient infrastructure to help us provide critical services that we want to provide at the local level, as well as those constraints. Constraints in helping create vulnerable communities and really separating people from their ecologies. And so I'd like to begin, though, with a story, perhaps one not quite as riveting or risque as my title might suggest. 50 Shades of Green, this is going to be the G version. So we're looking for uncertainty in the relationship between land use laws and uncertainty. So the story, though, takes place in Iowa, where I'm from, and it involves one piece of infrastructure that provides a service, a critical service, again, that has encountered 3 disturbances, rapid and intense disturbances, over the time of only 6 months. And it takes place in 2012-13. During that time, Iowa experienced severe, extreme, and exceptional drought throughout the state. The drought put immense pressure on infrastructure, including emergency services, energy, transportation, and most relevant to this story, water. This here is a photo of an image taken at that time, rather a tributary to one of the 2 main streams that the Des Moines Waterworks pulls from to provide water to hundreds of thousands of people, over 500,000 people. And so you get a sense from this image how difficult it was for the Des Moines Waterworks to provide potable water to, as I said, 500,000 people at this time. While the waterworks was struggling with how to provide water, the drought ended when 19 inches of rain fell during the springtime. Now, 19 inches of rain in the spring in Iowa was the most since 1892. Well, along with that rain came massive amounts of flooding. Like droughts, floods in Iowa are now somewhat frequent. This year is not from 2013 when our story takes place. This is 20 years earlier in 1993. This is obviously a flood, but what I like about this image here is those buildings that are flooded right there, that's the Des Moines Waterworks. It's under about 8 feet of water. It was unable to provide potable water for 3 weeks. As I said, floods, though, between 93 and 2013 happened a fair amount, including in 2007, 2008, 2010, 12, and 15. Here's an image from 2008. The waterworks is that now surrounded, that image there, although you can see we've, those of you in my climate change class will appreciate this, we've adapted, right? So we have this 15-foot berm around the Des Moines waterworks that now protects it from the flooding. In addition, so here the waterworks is first struggling with too little water, then it's struggling with too much water. But in addition to the flooding, the quick shift in moisture also brought a change in the ecology. This here is a chart that tracks the nitrates that were in the two primary rivers, the Raccoon River and the Des Moines River, that the waterworks pulls from. And what it's showing in that deep green bar across the middle is 10 parts per million. That's the maximum the EPA allows for potable water in terms of nitrates. Right? So anything above that, the Des Moines waterworks cannot circulate. You can see during the spring of 2013, those numbers are well in excess of it. Fortunately, or maybe not so fortunately, the Des Moines waterworks has one of the most sophisticated reverse osmosis systems in the world, and can pull out the nitrates at a cost of $5,000 to $7,000 extra a day. So, but if this was in Eugene, for example, chances are you all don't have a reverse osmosis system. It's pretty unusual, although you're near some agricultural lands, maybe you do, but I doubt it. But like droughts and floods, these changes now are also somewhat frequent. These are the nitrate trends from January this year. And you can see again, both the red and the yellow, those are the two rivers, they are floating above the 10 parts per million. The line below the 10 parts per million is the water that's coming out of the reverse osmosis system. And so now it can be distributed. So I think that this story is an interesting one. I think we can talk a lot about resiliency and infrastructure and the importance of infrastructure in many aspects of this. But I think one of the things that's most telling about it is it shows what the infrastructure is facing in terms of rapid, intense, often contrary disturbances. And the question is, how can they deal with those? But more specifically for this conversation here, how can land use laws really make this better? In other words, how can land use laws be used to support the resiliency and build resiliency into this piece of infrastructure, along with others? To explore this question about land use laws, I'd like to look at three things. The first is I'll backcast by kind of setting forth what we might put forth if we wanted our ideal vision of land use laws. So if we could wipe the slate clean, what would we want our land use laws to look like that would support resilient infrastructure? Next, I'll turn to one obstacle in specific. There are many obstacles to achieving this vision, but I want to turn to one specifically, and that is the land use laws themselves. And then I'll provide one example, and Keith, I think, is going to provide a couple more examples, but one example that begins to implement this ideal vision. Okay, so to start, what might land use laws look like if we wanted them to support resilient infrastructure? Well, first we need to define resilient infrastructure, and there are many ways in which we can define resilient infrastructure, but for argument's sake now, we can talk about this more later, I defined it as a system of intelligent, integrated infrastructure that, number one, resists. It absorbs disturbances and it rebounds quickly. Number two, it adapts. It's constantly learning, it's anticipating, it's responding, and it's operating flexibly. And then number three, it transforms. It rebuilds, it recreates itself in an efficient and timely manner to improve upon itself. Now, land use laws that support this type of vision will obviously vary by jurisdiction. Jurisdictions face a variety of different needs, assets, conditions that depend on their particular circumstances. However, there are some consistencies among land use laws, the most prominent being, for our purposes, is that they always are impacting some form of infrastructure. So if we could start anew, one vision of land use laws that would support that vision of resilient infrastructure. The first is it would incorporate a systems thinking, poly-resilience approach, which would regulate infrastructure as a single integrated system. What I mean by that is instead of putting transportation over here, water over here, waste over here, energy over here, we integrate them. We think about them more holistically. And this is fairly common stuff infrastructure is going to suffer if transportation infrastructure suffers. Energy is going to suffer if water suffers. And so they rely on each other, and we should think of that more as a system. The second thing that land use law is going to incorporate is adaptive governance. And so that would include, number one, obtaining would be relevant to how social ecological systems, things outside of the infrastructure, are impacting the infrastructure. So the ecological changes that we looked at with the Des Moines waterworks, for example. Obtaining information on how those systems are changing, monitoring and assessing that information, and then adapting based on assessment. So constantly updating the infrastructure. And then the third thing that land use laws can incorporate is an ecosystem services approach, in which the law embraces benefits that ecosystems rather provide. Unfortunately, as currently drafted, land use laws are doing very little of this. Whether we're talking about poly resilience, system thinking, adaptive governance, or ecosystem services. In trying to do so, local governments face a whole host of challenges. And I've listed a number of those challenges on the board here. You're probably familiar with number 2, for example, deteriorating infrastructure. Number 3, lack of financial resources. These are many challenges that are often prohibited. But the one that I want to focus on is the last one there, and that is the existing land use laws themselves. And the existing land use laws really provide 2 challenges to local governments when looking to enhance resiliency in infrastructure. And they can be characterized as stationarity and the focus on great infrastructure. So let's start with the first one there, stationarity. And it's really summed up by this quote, I think, by C.S. Holling. C.S. Holling, for those of you who don't know him, he is an ecologist. He's also one of the intellectual founders of the concept of resilience. And what he says is, in a system anticipating transformation, laws in our infrastructure, right? Something that is anticipating changes. Right? He says, in a system anticipating transformation, in a flip from one state to another, laws are truly of limited help because variables and processes and unknown risks and opportunities emerge. The idea is that law is fixed in time. Right? There's little opportunity to adapt to changes as they occur. This is particularly true with land use laws, where the physical manifestation of the laws themselves translates into the built environment. It's something that's going to be around for quite a while. Let me give you an example of stationarity. As many of you know, comprehensive plans can take 1 to 4 years to complete. They can often involve dozens of meetings, hundreds of stakeholders, and we do all this upfront work, and the result fixes land use patterns for the next 10 to 20 years. In Des Moines, for example, our comprehensive plan was drafted in the year 2000. Well, since then, our population has changed, our economy has changed, our ecology has changed, as we talked about earlier. Now, there are obviously ways to amend a comprehensive plan, but there's nothing, or there's very little opportunity built directly in the plan to adapt to the changes as they come. The second way in which land use laws exacerbate vulnerabilities is through gray infrastructure, promoting gray infrastructure. And by gray infrastructure, I mean man-made, engineered infrastructure, often using steel or concrete. Site plan reviews are a good example of these. Those of you unfamiliar with site plan reviews, basically, they're an opportunity for local governments to look at an entire site and all the issues that are involved with that site. In Des Moines, shortly before I came here in January, we had a proposal for a site plan that is the one that is the site up here. It was for 220 units on 18 acres. The request, like many, included almost the complete clearing of the trees on the site. And what they were going to replace it with was not only the apartments, but also gray infrastructure. And as an example, they pointed to the site next door, which, as you can see, many wide avenues, parking, and this, which I don't think you can see in the image here, all this on the, what would be the southeast quarter of the site, was all detention ponds. So they proposed to remove pretty much most of the trees on the site. The tree mitigation ordinance in Des Moines, which I put up here on the screen, has a significant exception to it. And that exception basically says if you replace trees with forms of gray infrastructure, you need not put the trees back somewhere. So what this ended up doing was requiring that the developer on that site up there only replace about 25 to 30% of the trees that they're removing. Now, while that's somewhat troubling, I think what's also troubling about it was that the information required by the developer in their application for the site permit is set up on the board, but what's important, what's missing, is that there's no cost analysis of how much does it cost, or what is the benefit we get out of these trees, and what is the harm that we are going to experience through the gray infrastructure, both long-term, short-term. And what I'm talking about are, for example, trees provide stormwater mitigation benefits, right? The very thing we're trying to provide through these detention ponds. They also retain soil. They help with energy conservation. And perhaps most importantly, they help build community. One of the things that is required in terms of the information that they have to provide on the site plan is this one down here, minimum parking requirements. I see someone smiling, that's good. Are you familiar with minimum parking requirements? Good. Good. Yeah, they're incredibly pervasive and they're fascinating. It's a good read on a nice Friday night. So what minimum parking requirements, and I've set up an example up here from Clyde, which is right next door to Des Moines. But what they do is they say, if you're going to have this type of building at this size, you have to provide this minimum amount of parking. So here's an example. This is a quote-unquote restaurant, McDonald's, that is about 40,000 square feet and 60 parking slots there over here. Here's another example, though, that I think not only do you have minimums, but the developer is allowed to exceed those minimums. And this was a good example of that. This is from West Des Moines, which is a separate city, but also adjacent to Des Moines. The developer here was required to put in 448 parking spots. They requested 691 spaces, and they were granted the right to do that. These spots are rarely used, but I think more importantly for our purposes is there's no accounting for the burdens that this places on infrastructure generally. Right? And that, I think, is one of the primary issues with land use is they allow and they focus on this gray infrastructure. Now, these examples, of course, only scratch the surface of the many provisions throughout land use laws and throughout the country, but the fact that they begin to illustrate how land use laws focus on stationarity and gray infrastructure. And they highlight the need to look into the details of land use laws and question whether they're unintentionally locking cities into a pattern of inflexibility that fails to account for uncertainty and social ecological changes. So if we come full circle now, let me give you an example, or end with an example that begins to incorporate, again, what we would think of as maybe our ideal vision of land use laws, and one that incorporates systems thinking, adaptive governance, and ecosystem services. And it really moves away from this static version of land use. It comes from Dubuque, Iowa, and Dubuque in 2012 began tracking its success or its failures on resilience. And they identified 12 issues that they would track, including clean water, and healthy air, and energy. For these 12 things, they identified 60 metrics. So here's the beginning of adaptive governance. Right? We're identifying what information we need and how we're going to move forward. For each of these 60 metrics, they produced a form in which they would show how they're doing, why it's important. This one here is for the stream, for the water quality, and it's showing the contaminated streams in and around Dubuque. What it's also showing, though, is that there is an increase in the percentage of streams that are around Dubuque that are having contaminated issues. Based on that information, then, the city of Dubuque decided to take action. And the way in which they took action was to incorporate ecosystem services. They converted 240 alleys into what they call green alleyways. They put in permeable pavement, and it reduced runoff by about 80%. By integrating adaptive governance and following up with an ecosystem services solution, one that also thinks about systems thinking, right? Because the alleyway is a mode of transportation, but they're looking at it in terms of water filtration as well. Dubuque is leveraging the opportunities in land use to help recognize the changes that are happening around it. And some local governments should consider land use laws as an opportunity to enhance resilience and infrastructure and proactively connect people with the natural world. Thanks. Any comments?
Hi, I'm Keith HIROKAWA. I teach at Albany Law. I'm here just for tonight. Thank you for having me. It's kind of awesome. So just to get started, by way of making sure you understand, I think these guys are great. And it becomes very clear when we all sort of laid out what we're going to talk about tonight. And these fantastic whizzy things that are flying all over the screen, they wanted to see what I had. And I had a word written on my hand, community. And this is like my version of PowerPoint. Now, I apologize for that. I'm a little outdated or something. But the crazy part is in sort of this idea of thinking that maybe land use law is a problem because it can't do some of the things that we want it to, because I sort of think we can. But it's important to start at trying to figure out what we're trying to accomplish and figure out what our tools are to get there. So one of the things that we're thinking about these days very seriously, that you heard about from Professor Rosenblum, is ecosystem service. Oh, the other part was there were a lot of promises about all this great stuff that I was going to talk about and John too. I'm not sure, it was an oversell. But ecosystem services, nonetheless. Ecosystem services, you can sort of think about loosely as machinery by which nature provides an awful lot of benefits to humans. Ecosystems work in systems type operations, but ecosystems all are functional in very connected ways, and the functionality is what matters. Half of what matters. The functionality matters because they have to all keep working together and keep working. But when we try to figure out the service part of ecosystems, it's when it matters to people. Ecosystem services are the manner in which ecosystems benefit humans. It's a very human-oriented concept, no doubt about it, but it's one way to think about ways to value a functioning ecosystem. The ecosystem services are the ways that ecosystems provide very real, very necessary benefits to human life and well-being. So some of these things are odd. Okay, so one of the things that I always thought was sort of an interesting story was the Cuyahoga River. Have you heard of this one before? Yeah, what happened at the Cuyahoga?
Cuyahoga.
Oh.
He's from.
I'm from Binghamton.
Yeah, I'm not. Okay, the Cuyahoga River. I wanted to do the scare quote thing. It makes me look like an idiot, I get it, but okay. The Cuyahoga River, what happened? That's famous.
They caught on fire like 7 times.
9 times.
There.
There. So this is a fascinating thing. Why did it catch on fire? You know this one? At 20,000 feet, why did it catch on fire? It caught on fire because at the time, we were taking advantage of ecosystem services. Water flows all the time in this particular river. And this really cool magic trick that you could throw something in it, and you could turn around, and when you turn back around, it's gone. So the Cuyahoga was very effective at dealing with the waste problem, right? Because if you don't throw it in the river, what happens? Waste piles up, we all get sick, which we don't want. So throw it in the river. Now, it may not have been the wisest use of ecosystem services, but it's an example of the manner in which we relate to our environment and take benefits off of the way that ecosystems work in this particular example is watersheds. Now, it was unwise because we threw a lot of stuff in the Cuyahoga River and it became so murky and disgusting with it. And interestingly enough, when it caught on fire in 1969, it was the 9th time that it had done so. It only burned for a little while, a little less than half an hour, not long enough for somebody to take a picture. And nonetheless, the picture appeared on the cover of Time magazine, and it sparked the revolution. We had federal environmental law incredibly soon after that. Picture, as it turns out, wasn't from the 1969 fire. It was from a fire several years before. Fascinating history. Oh, but the important one is ecosystems do stuff, and we can capture the benefits. Right? Other examples of this: bees acting as pollinators, wetlands acting to filter water, filtered pollutants out active as habitat. All kinds of things that are happening out in the environment, actually out in our community, that we benefit from. Ecosystem services are valuable largely in ways that we can't fathom because we don't trade these services on the market. Nobody goes shopping to pay top dollar for the swampiest land they can find. Donald Trump certainly not. Right? It doesn't have a market value. We don't trade services. We certainly don't trade ecosystem services. And so they're difficult to value. In fact, our market system evaluation have excluded these over time. The concept of ecosystem services and the study of ecosystem services is to try to find a way to give a comparable market type of value to these services. One of the ways we do it are replacement costs. We try to value the loss of services. Let's say if the wetland that was cleaning water before it was filled in and lost, what would be the price of a filtration plant to do the same function? We can price that out as a result. We can try to figure out, at least as to that particular service, what was being provided that benefited human well-being. Another really cool one that, if I remember, I'll talk about later, is greenery next to hospitals. Has anybody heard about this service? Apparently there are studies that show that post-surgery recovery can be sped up significantly if the recovery rooms are in the line of sight of trees. Something about the greenery helps people walk through faster. I don't understand how it works. I can just tell you what the report says. I think it's pretty cool. Okay, so that's ecosystem services. We're talking about functionality, right? Because if the ecosystem stops working, it stops becoming functional, we can't provide benefits anymore. When we start thinking about green infrastructure, largely what we're talking about is capturing ecosystem services in our infrastructure, capturing the benefits in the way we design and construct our infrastructure. We have to think about how significant it could be if we could do this with the thousands of miles of road, pipe, utility lines, the pumps, all the things that we do to make sure we're connected to one another. If we can figure out ways to integrate ecosystem service concepts into them, we don't need to build everything to get those things done. At least in theory, and certainly a lot of evidence shows it, that when we're taking advantage of ecosystem services, we're providing the things that need to be provided cheaper and in a much more valuable way. We can talk about that. Okay, so the question here for my discussion is, how does this work? How do we make it work? How do we get this ecosystem services concept on the ground, and in particular on the ground through law? And this is the idea of capturing that ecosystem services. But one of the things, there's sort of three really important parts, and four for many of you are first year law students, right? Okay, so the place I'm going to end, I understand something you just learned about, which is taking this law. We're going to get hopefully brief. So three, maybe four things that you have to hit. The first, in just about all good laws that implement ecosystem services concepts, requires an inventory of ecosystem assets. We need to know what we've got and of what particular type of ecosystem benefit we are getting. And then this is important because it will matter based on geographic location. Right? That is to say, we are all ecologically situated. Right? If we are in an area where we don't get rain, certain kinds of benefits won't apply. Other ones very much will. Right? The flip side, for whatever our ecosystem characteristics might be. So we need to take an inventory and an assessment of that inventory. What is our native vegetation like? What is the population? What are the population trends like? How do people engage in their transportation? Do we even have native vegetation left? Do we have rain? These are very important questions to ask when we try to figure out how we're going to integrate ecosystem services into our project. Do we have water quality challenges? What are the dominant land uses? Very specific. The question is, how much land is left? The bigger probably will be developed. Right? Because the undeveloped lands may be ecosystem service opportunities. These are sort of things to think about. Okay, so how do we implement this? The land use laws that we currently have on the books often do and sometimes can require the inventory assessment. Although we don't have as much of it in Oregon, certainly the types of laws we have at the state and local level that require an environmental impact review, such as NEPA at the state level, SEPA and SECRA, very much require us to take the inventory assessment, functionality, ecosystem, all kinds of assets we have. We have local laws in Oregon as well that deal with soil infiltration, that deal with taking wetlands delineations, looking at tree surveys to figure out what the trees are, kinds of trees, and tree density can. So there are laws on the books that get us started towards ecosystem services, to get the information on the table. What are our ecosystem assets? What is functionality? The second thing, and the second legal component of this to implement ecosystem service concept is to minimize the disruption of ecosystem assets and functions. All right, so thinking through this, we realize that the existing ecosystem services, the ones that we currently benefit from, they're already in place. So they are going to be more important to keep in place, right? We don't have to establish them, they're going to be cheaper. We depend on them already. Right? So if you, let's say you live there, it's because, if you live in a particular location, you've already adapted to local circumstances. You already depend on whatever the vegetation happens to be, how where the water goes. The important thing, and this is where I get to use the word community, is that local is where ecosystem services is significant, or at least to the extent that ecosystem loss is very significant. When you think about the kinds of environmental and pollution problems we have, we often talk about them at the very 20,000 foot kind of level. We talk about toxics and the rate of carcinogen rate, based on exposure. We talk about maybe carbon emissions at a very large scale. And all of this is very disheartening and problematic and very inspiring to work on. But it matters a little differently when we lose, let's say, 50 or 100 trees in a block, right? Or a couple tons of soil on one farm, right? Things that matter locally are those losses that prevent us from getting the benefits from ecosystems anymore. That doesn't happen at the national scale, it happens very locally, which is why we need to think very specifically about minimizing the loss on a local basis. So how do we do this? Well, we have land use laws on the books. This is some of the very cool laws that we like to talk about with laws like this, that goes to protecting habitat functions and values. Vancouver, Washington has this fantastic law that if you're going to disrupt any vegetation, especially anything near a riparian area, that there has to be some kind of accounting for functions and values served by the vegetation. And the criteria for approval of a development permit is a no net loss of functions and values. Well, that's fascinating stuff, right? That means we have to dig in and figure out how we are benefiting locally, in particular, from a functioning ecosystem, make sure that that's not disrupted. It's a very cool law, it's very innovative, it's not widespread, it certainly serves as a model. Other kinds of laws are a little easier to deal with. Some of them have blanket exemptions, like Professor Rosenblum was talking about. Maybe they're problematic, but of course, clear can be easy. It doesn't give us as lawyers much work, but it certainly allows people to understand what we're doing. Sometimes the laws are strictly preservationist. You're not allowed to touch any trees, any habitats, special species, and some such things. The most common, like prevailing wetlands laws, deal with minimizing and mitigating destruction of habitat. A lot of our wetlands laws specifically go to wetlands functions that require some kind of assessment of the functionality, the quality of the habitat before we dig. They can be effective. What they certainly go to is try to get at is functionality, very specifically how we benefit, how we can minimize The third feature that we should be looking at in land use law dealing with ecosystem services is incorporation of natural features and processes into the design and construction of infrastructure, but of course also of any construction or private property as well. If we're thinking about construction, in this context, we're probably thinking about green building. In the process, in the context of infrastructure, we're thinking about something a little bit different than green building, but now we're talking about things like low impact development. I'm not sure if you've heard of this one before. The idea of low impact development, which is kind of cool, is to think through, again, design and construction of our infrastructure to make it mimic pre-development conditions. Now, this is a little bit ecosystem services because a lot of what we're going to do is allow vegetation to do the job that it was doing before. So if we're going to pave, we need to make sure that there's enough vegetation to capture the extra water that's no longer infiltrating the ground. But there's more to it than that. We can actually mimic pre-development functionality in very built ways as well, such as porous paving. Porous pavement is sort of a service project, but it's largely a built infrastructure design to make sure that we are not creating more of an impact than we had before we started. I don't want to go too far into this because I know there are many questions, but I do want to address the last problem, which is property. And mostly because you're dealing with the very might as well. Some of them. Talk about, one of the reasons ecosystem services has had such a difficult time making it forward is because we are predominantly in a property-driven system of application. That is to say, if you value it, it's probably because it's yours. Right? The stuff you're wearing, the stuff you're holding, the stuff you bought online, you're ready to be shipped. Right? We can raise our flag and say this is mine, and the system loves it. I think it's fantastic. Right? The right to exclude, the right to sell, the right to be private. We embolden ourselves with property limits, and this makes the system work. Because we allow individuals to value in this way, we allow individuals to decide not just what lives, but what dies too. That is to say, there's a question about whether the right to destroy is part of the property. This is why services have not been able to be on par with commodities. Right? The fact that we trade commodities in the market and not services. It's been difficult to figure out how to find equivalent values for things that just don't have that kind of tangible trade. So that being the case, that is to say, the system has already allowed us to figure out how to value nature and has protected that by property. All of the stuff you're learning about and taking in first year property rights very much apply. Right? If what we're talking about is a regulation that's going to devalue, right, take away all the economic value, and what's the name of this case, by the way? To deny all economically viable use of the property? Yes. Yeah, that's right. And the burden has to shift to the state to prove that the restriction inherent in the title itself was otherwise background principle of state property rights. We need to figure out how ecosystem services fits into that. So this is a challenge. Granted, most takings challenges fail because Penn Central, much more difficult in claims is sort of a pro-government analysis. But nonetheless, when we're dealing with changing the way we value something that someone owns, we are playing around some dangerous territory. We need to figure out why that valuation is persuasive and why it is on par and competes with market valuation to make sure this stuff works. That's the challenge.
So I'm going to collect questions, and I'll come up and ask a few questions, and then Gordon's also going to ask a few other questions once you collect them all.
We don't mind if people just raise their hands and we get a dialogue going.
Is that easier, Alexis?
If you prefer, whatever. We're just doing this to avoid redundancy, but
We love redundancy.
We love redundancy. It makes us sound smart.
that's a fact.
In the biodiversity, area biodiversity, we find that connectivity is a major piece of it that we're missing in the cities. We're not connecting these little islands, which can magnify the ecological effect of these islands by over 100%. Just by connecting with permeable cement and all. Does that ever come up to in zoning and creating paths? Doesn't take much, and you can triple the holding power, the number of animals and plants that can survive in small.
Yeah, I was reading about some stuff just a couple months ago about connectivity and salamanders. Right? Apparently salamanders are the most important critter in the food chain. Anybody know? May have but it's important to make sure, so that means that survival of salamanders is actually pretty important. And one of the things we do with these corridors to connect patch habitats, which is basically what we have in urban habitat, is to make sure we're getting diversity, biodiversity, and so to make sure they can move. So I'm happy to start.
There's an example I'm aware of out of Maryland where they mapped out what they are referring to as green infrastructure at the state level, but it was a much larger scale approach than I think you're getting at the city level. And the idea was we want to map out these corridors, we want to map out the patches and these other sorts of things, and use state funding to preserve the lands that are of high value to try to preserve those corridors. But that's something that from a 30,000 foot level is hard to apply at site analysis, kind of what Jonathan was getting into. It requires you to think larger than just the site when you're doing development review. You can't just think about reviewing this one project, you have to think about how it connects. And that's something I think we're not very good at doing yet.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is that in addition to the sort of the site versus the 30,000 foot, we also run into jurisdictional problems. And with land use, where we have each city is its own fiefdom, the biodiversity corridors don't correspond to those jurisdictions. And so what we really need to see is some sort of collaboration among the local governments for a regional approach. And we don't see a whole lot of that except maybe some stuff in transportation. We're seeing more and more watersheds. Keith and I have this ongoing discussion about what would it look like if cities did not, instead of having this random sort of jurisdictional boundary, instead corresponded directly to ecosystems. How would that change society?
So your mailbox number.
Here in Oregon, where we separated the Coast Range from the Cascades with the valley, and we're seeing some big problems because of that. And in Iowa, for instance, we had those great shelter belts that connected things, and then we plowed them out because they weren't economical.
Well, the other two things to think about, two trends in this area. One is that some states and local governments in particular have protections for riparian corridors. So on a site-by-site basis, if there are creeks, if there are riparian areas, wetland areas, that they're subject, this is what I was referring to before, subject to functionality limitations on what can be changed. Now, given the way that watersheds work and the way creeks are connected, this can create a lot of habitat corridors. That's sort of the purpose of these regulations. The other thing to think about is kind of interesting, and it's sort of a trend, is this idea of exacted conservation covenant. So some governments, local governments in particular, are experimenting with the idea as part of development review as an exaction, take out covenants not to develop, and easements to sort of take out the title easements as conservation measures in exchange for them. We used to do this in the context of open space regulations to do trades and stuff like that. Here now we're targeting very specific areas, sometimes at the county level, at the 20,000 foot area photography level, to figure out where this habitat might be. Interestingly enough, there are a couple. New York actually has legislation that allows local governments to adopt TDR programs, transferable development right programs, specifically for this reason, for green space, greenway corridors for open space, where they prioritize particular areas of habitat and by way of exaction of trade will require. That's interesting.
Thinking about governance on this issue, do you think that we need new institutions that are specifically dedicated to promoting resilience, ecosystem services, and green infrastructure outcomes? Or can we more easily amend the institutions we have that are used to doing gray infrastructure and teach them how to do new things?
I think the answer to the question is it depends on the issue, right? Because I think some things are much better dealt with, or we can deal with them better if we have a rethinking of the government structure. So a watershed, for example, is good, and which is exactly what's happening in many jurisdictions as well. Other things, though, I think we have to look at the flip side of it, and that is the benefit of local government. So what do we like about local government in terms of decentralization and public discourse, public virtue, that kind of thing? And I don't think we're going to be so willing to really let some of that stuff go as a trade-off.
It's a fantastic question. I mean, yes, and yes, and yes, is sort of the answer here. I think there were these three questions. So because a separate office that has this areas of expertise would be fantastic, at least for a literacy component, right? That is to say, if we had one guy, one person out there that had all they were supposed to do was make sure everybody knew about this, that would be cool. The best would be to first recognize that a lot of our agencies, our officials have been doing this stuff all along. That was the HIROKAWA example. Is that, we've been assimilating and adapting to our local environments for a really long time. In fact, gray infrastructure, that's really what that is anyway. We need to travel. We're going to have to figure out how to get there. The soil's not hard enough to take the wheels of our car, so we're going to adapt a little bit. But it's still a concept of trying to figure out how to relate to our environment. What we're doing, one of the things that we do often with our agencies and our experts is we modify best management practices. We adopt our BMP manuals all the time. We update them. With all the new evidence, new facts, and new concepts and principles. And this could be as easy as saying, it's time to go through the process again. Let's rethink what we've been doing, and let's do better. Because we know how to do better. Let's get rid of the stuff that was more important. Like all things, going in new directions is complicated. So nothing's easy.
I have kind of a similar implementation question. So in the context of Oregon, with our 19 goals, I'm wondering if you think it would maybe be, you started talking about best management practices, would it be as easy as requiring our local governments to do this systems-based approach and ecosystem services analysis in their sort of site plan reviews for development, and then they require it in comp plans in local governments here? Do you think that would start making progress towards building more green infrastructure?
Yes, I think it's almost unavoidable, right? In that once you start looking at adaptive governance and certainly ecosystem services, but also systems thinking, I don't think there's any way to not have that. And if there's any way to have that analysis without thinking about incorporating the green aspects of infrastructure. Does that answer your question?
But I would say we have a tendency to focus on farm and forest land at its face without really digging into what's underlying. And so there may be ways even to integrate some of this into the existing processes to think kind of more systems-based approach. But it would require moving away from just farm and forest land to prioritizing ecosystem services above those things.
Right.
So the farmland might not, rank greatest highly in terms of the ecosystem services.
Right. And your observation though about putting it with the 19 goals, that's critical because then you cast the umbrella.
One other important thing to think about too, I'm fairly convinced by the ecosystem resource analysis and systems thinking pretty much every context. But it's really just one more tool. Right? And I think it's important to recognize But the idea isn't that it's the only way to do it, and sometimes it's not even the best. Right? I mean, any tool in the framework that you're using to resolve or even understand a particular problem has to relate to the problem you're trying to solve. We were involved a little bit in this one case up in New York, not New York, Washington, where the question was breaching some historic dikes, reflooding some ag land for 100 years. One of the questions, I mean, it wasn't productive ag, it wasn't farm ag, but it was complicated because the loss of farming land was very problematic for Farm Bureau and just the concept of it, you didn't know it was a strike to something. And so the local government ordered the ecosystem services to compare the salmon rearing habitat value versus the ag value. And in this particular case, the salmon value outpaced the ag value by a lot. And once this became public and this draft report went out, it was political. The idea was the kind of choices you're making official to people, you're gone, right? So the report never made it into the decision-making process. They did exactly what they were going to do, but not on the basis of ecosystem services. It did not answer the question, even if it was a fantastic answer. So it's important recognizing these are just frameworks. Right? The tools are very helpful sometimes. Sometimes they're a little too helpful.
Don't you think, though, that there's a little bit of a dispute out there? I mean, you and I agree on this point, that those three things are non-normative in fact, right? That they're just designed to get information. And then what you do with that information is a different story, right? But there is some literature out there, particularly on ecosystem services, that says that this is actually a normative approach. Again, we don't necessarily agree with that, but that is out there. You should look at it.
And in fact, one of the interesting things, the very few times that people have approached the courts with the failure of an agency to do ecosystem service analysis to understand some decision, the court has resisted going this direction. Right? That, essentially casting this as an argument about having better economics is just another kind of economics, which is interesting. And this is a catch-22 because when the court decided, this was a federal court or somewhere else, decided that this was just some other kind of economics, the court was able to say, because it's just another theory, not a particularly better one, I'm not going to make the agency do it.
Kind of in a different vein, has there been any exploration of what happens if you increase the scale of the green infrastructure? For example, 240 alleys in Moines is a little different than repaving the entirety of Los Angeles with permeable concrete. Has there been any sort of like, what happens in LA if all of their land now has water in it?
Yeah,
Water never makes it to the ocean. The ocean's dry through.
Well, New York City is a great example, right? About 100 years ago or so, or more, New York City was pulling its water that provides the entire city from the watershed in the Catskills. And it was some of the cleanest water in the country. Over time, development and agricultural land deteriorated that ecosystem such that the city was told by the EPA that it needed to build a new water treatment facility. And that would cost the city of New York, I think it was $1 billion in bonds a year, and $1 billion in operations a year for infinity, right, perpetuity. Right? And so instead of doing that, they went ahead and they purchased land in upstate New York, which I think they're now the largest landholder in the state of New York, the city is. And what they did with that is they protected it for the purposes of the watershed. And now they didn't have to build that water treatment facility. But that is a very large scale. Talking about water providing to 8 million people. So.
And actually, so that was a really cool cooperative venture too. So the New York State and New York City worked together to figure out how to get the authority to do this. New York City purchased a lot of its rights, some of them outright title purchases, some of them covenants and easements. In the meantime, the local governments in the watershed have to work with the city. Oftentimes just by agreement, but there's some kind of MOU that makes all of this coordinated really fast. all because of New York City's water source. And as a result, New York is actually not subject to the filtration requirements under the Water Act, because they can buy everything.
I was thinking of, and I think when you put it as ecosystem services as a tool, that I was thinking about it in terms of, you can just make the case that gray infrastructure is just really expensive without thinking about the sort of additional costs that through the ecosystems. And so, if it's just a tool, when are the best times to apply that tool? And how do you distinguish, this is a great time to make the case of ecosystem services. This is not a great time to make that case.
It totally depends on, there's no one answer to that question. I mean, it's a fantastic question, but it's kind of like the Smith Island example. I don't think anybody really, I'm not sure anybody outside of the economists thought that there was going to be such a disparity in value. And to be honest with you, I'm not sure anybody really foresaw the reaction. Everybody just kind of thought it was really cool. Like, look, we did this analysis and the fish, they're worth so much money. And that was, it just wasn't anticipated that it was going to have that much political traction. So it's hard to say. One of the things we've spent a lot of time doing ecosystem service analysis is loss. So there are a couple of federal statutes, particularly the ones that deal with oil and hazardous waste spills, where we're talking about how to recover, where ecosystem service values matters, because it's the loss, and essentially what we end up talking about in that context is the restoration, replacement value of the service that matters to people. Like, I don't care for you to give me money. I want the doggone pond back, the fish in it, so my kids can live there. So we have this thing that matters because of the loss, and it happens to be a very good time to do that analysis. There's not a lot to fight about it. It's difficult to prospectively, before loss, do this analysis. Because it's hard to say what that value is going to be. You're not sure with all the unanticipated consequences. Let's say the idea of maybe the watershed failing and you're actually going to have to go ahead and build that filtration plant anyway. It's a complicated thing to foresee.
If you want a good example, the Bullitt Center, which is in Seattle, it issued a report. It was an ecosystem services report of its own building. The report came out, I think, sometime early last year. But at least you can get from that report a sense of how you might begin to characterize the cost of ecosystems and ecosystem services. And then the question, then you can sort of look at your question in a more informed, or one could look at it in a more informed light, as if, how would we utilize this? In what place would we utilize this if we see the value in this way? It's a good report. If you're interested, you can find it.
Great question.
So going back to Ryan's point on the scale issue, you mentioned a whole list of issues facing cities, and one of the ones was overpopulation and growing needs from more infrastructure. And so when we're talking about a growing need and an already stressed ecosystem, how are we going to try and use ecosystem services on steroids? Right? How are we going to get them to do more than they're already doing in such a way that we can utilize it for the need that's not here now, but that's going to be here in 10, 15, 20 years when we're going to have all this infrastructure we're trying to plan now in effect.
You just want to know how you can make it into the persuasive argument of the preservation rate?
Well, I guess what I'm saying is that there's so many on the ground needs right now. How do you raise this as an issue to policymakers in such a way that it's actually addressed, and from a engineering or technical standpoint, how do we get not just beyond protecting and maintaining what we have, going further and going into that resilience aspect?
One of the most successful ecosystem projects to date in urban areas has been urban forests. There are a couple of groups that just go town to town and do what they call urban forest ecosystem services analysis. What they're looking for is what is the financial benefit to the city of having a particular canopy cover, a particular kind of tree, a particular density of trees? And they're coming up with some pretty significant numbers for reasons that you might not have thought. So then I have numbers written down, and it's really kind of cool, so I'm gonna look them up, let's just take a second. Vancouver, Washington, and I keep referring to them just because that's the information I have now. Vancouver, Washington did an ecosystem service analysis of its urban forest. Here's what it came up with. The tree canopy itself, and this is sort of, if you take an aerial photography, aerial photo, how much of the land is covered by leaves, provides an annual $12.9 million of avoided cost to taxpayers from avoiding and installing stormwater detention facilities. So that's runoff from storms down the streets. We have to capture it and take out the pollutants before we discharge the river. $78.3 million in air pollutant removal services. This is carbon capture all kinds of pollutants in the air. Trees are pretty good at filtering. Approximate reduction of 4% of cooling costs from shade. So this means we don't have to turn on our air conditioning. So it doesn't even get that hot in Vancouver, Washington. Vancouver estimates an annual net benefit per tree of $1 to $8 for small trees, 19 to 25 for medium, 48 to $53 for large. That's the annual benefit per tree. Now, the cost of maintaining an urban forest on private and public land is not all that significant, especially given that the cost of replanting is incredibly low. It doesn't take much to maintain trees, and this is the thing about natural infrastructure, about natural capital, is the cost of maintenance is fairly low. They do what they want to do, and they usually grow, especially from labor. Having this benefit that continues to increase in value every year is something that becomes a governance question for local governments if they avoid it. Right? If what we're doing, if what we could be doing in ecosystem service analysis, we're choosing not to, this is a governance question. So the fact that these groups have been able to go town to town and talk to them about the trees in financial ways makes ecosystem service actually pretty powerful too. This goes for towns that have no interest at all in aesthetics or trees. You know, this actually goes to some towns. There was a great story years and years ago about why trees had to be cut down. Everywhere you saw them in urban areas was because bad people would hide behind, jump out at you, get you. This was the most pervasive reason to not have urban trees, but even these days, police reports come out all the time and say, look, we have changed our minds. One of the things that trees does, and I told you, put them near hospitals is fantastic, but that's not even a really cool thing. You put trees in urban areas, and kids will go out and play around them. And when kids go out and play around them, their parents go out to watch them. And when the parents go out to watch them, we start having picnics, build community, the whole area gets safe. This is one of these benefits that you can't even really put a price on. Right? These are the ones that, in addition to the stormwater retention costs, shade costs, air pollutant removal costs, that benefit the cities in ways that you just cannot account for. So, how does it work? Is ecosystem services persuasive? It's persuasive not because you don't have much left of an ecosystem to bank on. It's persuasive because ecosystems can add value as much as they can retain value. That if we do the study to figure out how it is we react and interact with ecosystems, oftentimes it will be very persuasive just on the numbers to think very seriously about what our ecosystem should, what our community should do.
That's all the time we have for questions, and I'd like to say that it's great that we ended this talk about infrastructure with comments about community. I think that's really interesting.
It's the PowerPoint.
And
Get my hand up the whole time.
if we could give a round of applause for it, that's all that.